Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where we assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. Hello, I'm your host, John Plotz, and specifically welcome now to our summer series on the Brahmin left, past, present, and future. I think today we might call this the series of the Brahmin left and perhaps the Tea Party right, since we're interested not just in the movement of educated upper middle class people towards traditional left parties like the Democrats, but also in the movement of working class and less educated citizens towards the right and the Republican Party. And so we can really imagine no better guest for that aspect of this series than the renowned sociologist Arlie Hochschild. Hello, Arlie.
Hey.
Hi. It's great to have you. So my co-host for this third of our Brahmin Left series is Adana Usmani, a sociologist at Harvard, whom you've previously heard talking about mass incarceration in episode 44, and then in episode 51's conversation with Thomas Piketty himself. So hi, Adana.
Hi, John. Hi, Arlie.
So it was that conversation with Piketty, in fact, that inspired this series, because Piketty has in recent years analyzed ways in which European and American left-wing parties have increasingly drawn their support from an educated, non-working class political base. So today is the last of three conversations, and previous ones were with the American historian Matt Karp and expert on European populism, Jan Werner Müller, in which we think with and around that Piketty claim that there's been a, quote, class de-alignment that leaves many highly educated folks, so-called PMC, serving as a new core of left parties. So if Piketty's facts and figures are right, how do we understand that shift? Is it a tribute to effective strategies among right-wing parties, a sign of the decoupling of left political platforms from the material interests of the poor and working class, or some other kind of ominous or potentially reversible realignment in the structure of representative politics generally? Well, when it comes to thinking about this decoupling or the possibility of a post-material politics, our thoughts turned naturally to a pivotal 2016 book that pointed out some frequently overlooked currents in how Americans had shifted their form of political affiliation and the sorts of emotional investment that accompanied that affiliation. So Arlie Hochschild's books, at least 10 by my count, and I'm sure I've left some out, Arlie, along with countless articles, range from her 1973, The Unexpected Community, and 1983's The Managed Heart, to the 2012 wonderful The Outsourced Self, Intimate Life in the Market. And to top it all off, she's also a distinguished professor, I guess professor emerita now at UC Berkeley. Still, all of her previous honors notwithstanding, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right was a thunderclap of a book, way beyond the traditional markers of success for academic sociology. This was not simply because of its timeliness, as members of the Brahmin left woke up to the countercurrent that swept other voters firmly into the Republican camp, but also because the voices in it rang so true and testified so sincerely to the feelings and the sort of deep story understanding that accompanied that movement. So Arlie, again, thank you so much for coming on, and we really look forward to this conversation. And Adana, do you want to just sort of kick it off with an opening question?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Arlie. It's really exciting to get to speak to you about this. I thought that the place to start would be kind of with the widest lens, to begin with a sketch of the argument of Strangers in Their Own Land for people who haven't read it.
I spent 5 years getting to know people in what turns out to be one of the heartland of not only the Tea Party, believers in the Tea Party, but Donald Trump enthusiasts. So this is in Louisiana, which is not just the South, which generally is very red region, but the super South. And not only that, but I was focusing on a region that is organized around the petrochemical industry. And I was interviewing and getting to know people who were involved in that industry, who were white, who were older, who many were extremely religious. And so that's about 100 of them, but I focused in. I asked where they were born, what school they went to. We went to the schoolhouse, what row did you sit in? Did you like school? Who was your favorite teacher? Where are your kin buried? Were any of them in the Civil War? No, because you're Cajuns and you were in the swampland avoiding. You were, and okay, so in the course of this journey, I heard a lot, and the act of emotional labor for me as a researcher was turn my own alarm system off, really just take in what I'm hearing, permit myself to get very curious and interested in what I was hearing. What that added up to was not just a bunch of opinions, but a sense of the deepest feelings that the people I came to know felt. And what I did was make up a story, metaphors, like a dream, that I felt expressed those. And then I went back to them. What do you think? Would you change it? Is there a different one? Is it really speak to you or just a little bit? And I found out it really spoke to them. People said, oh, you've read my mind. I live your metaphor. And some people would correct it. But here was the deep story then. Imagine yourself, you're a 55-year-old white man and you're waiting in line. Your feet are forward and you're facing, as in a pilgrimage, the American dream. It's at the top of the hill. And you're not at the back of the line, you're not at the front, you feel you're somewhere in the middle.
I'd love your thoughts about the genealogy from a class-based model of political parties. Like if we think about the Democrats traditionally as a party of the working class versus the Republicans as a party, let's say, of bankers or property owners, that's so different from the deep story you're telling here. Like class, I didn't even, the word class doesn't even enter into that deep story, right? So what are your thoughts about that? Is it sort of more like, oh, the whole conception of class is gone? Or do you see a sort of genealogical transformation where the logic of class-based politics is still here, but the markers have changed? Is it a completely brave new world, or can we see what the connection is?
Here's what makes sense to me. And I would give primacy to therefore a story that begins like this. In the 1970s, we saw the beginning of a real thrust toward capital flight, basically globalization, so that companies said, as William Grader argues in One World, Ready or Not, that it untied its feet to the United States and sought cheaper labor pools around the world. And it therefore invested elsewhere, divested from American workers, so that the 1950s, 60s deal of, Henry Ford, look, I'll give you a well-paid job because I want you to have the money to buy what I have to, when we other capitalists have to sell. Our interests are aligned in this regard. That the flight of capital is a big, big deal. And I attach a series of social logics to that fact. So we're looking at intended consequences and unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. And the first consequence is that capitalism is a bunch of companies that compete with each other. And if you're moving offshore to cheaper labor in from the north to the south of the US, from the south to Mexico, from Mexico to China. If one company is doing it, the other has to stay competitive. So it's a system, and within it, there's built-in competition. So it has a momentum of that. But the flight of capital has weakened some institutions and strengthened others. So we're talking about primary resulting effects of that flight, and who it's weakened. And this has been argued by Bob Kuttner in Everything for Sale, which is a wonderful book. What it's weakened are the two institutions that used to be a brake on capitalism. One is labor unions, totally undercut, and the other is the federal government itself. It lost power too. So the two brakes on capitalism are weakened. They haven't gone away, but they're weakened. And that sets off a chain of secondary effects, both for the government and for labor unions.
The whole story you're telling here is a story of people creating ideological responses to these big structural shifts. And that really ties into, this is, I won't say it's a fight that Adana and I have been having, but a discussion we've been having about the relationship between those mental gymnastics and the kind of structural material changes that we see, that you're describing, the accumulation of wealth, the weakening of the unions. And I guess a way to phrase this is the deep story you're telling in your book is, do you see it as mainly post facto mental gymnastics? In other words, this is the story that people have to tell themselves to account for a structure that willy-nilly is doing this to them? Or is the mental gymnastics itself also an agent of change? Like, do the ideas that people have about what's happening to them themselves produce economic and material impacts? Or do they just register the fact that those things are happening willy-nilly to people?
Right. Well, let me add a point to our understanding of emotional gymnastics.
Yeah.
And that is that actually you don't have to do a lot in order to understand enthusiasm for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. For example, I talked to a man who said, Donald Trump's coming to town, this before the primary rally in 2020, and he's so exciting. He's lightning in a jar. Lightning in a jar. I said, well, tell me about that. What, no, how does that, why? And his first answer was not mental gymnastics. His first answer was very pragmatic. He said, he's the only one of the two parties, all the candidates, that's trying to fulfill my wish. And his wish was having those good old blue-collar jobs brought back to American soil. That made complete sense to him. That's the again, great again. It's a wish. It's a powerful wish.
What would it have taken for the history of the last 30, 40 years to have unfolded differently in your view, Arlie? So there's one version of the argument, which is let's call it the more structural version of the argument, which is suggesting that as you so masterfully outlined, there are these broad changes in the nature of American capitalism, which kind of make it rational for someone in the middle of the line to believe the things that they believe and to want the things that they want. But conceivably, I hope we'd have to think it could have been possible, maybe, and certainly Piketty believes this, for someone to come along and tell alternative, deep, story about the changes in American capitalism, which might be similar to the kinds of things that you were outlining, and point the finger not at the people who are cutting in line, but point the finger at the fat cats who are taking enormous shares of the GDP and building McMansions and things like this. And so I feel like one of the questions here has to be, where was that alternative deep story and why wasn't it successful? And maybe to take us to the left, why does it seem to be most successful with those people who are college educated and coastal residents rather than the people that you spoke to? Why is our deep story such a failure? I think one of the answers that you potentially might give is the answer that was in your narrative, which was that ultimately it is unions which were responsible for this alternative deep story, and these unions no longer exist. But now we live in a world without unions. What can be done to traffic a different kind of deep story? Why isn't our deep story more compelling, I guess is the kind of question. Is there a universe in which this could have gone differently, in which we told a different deep story, or were we always doomed to live these 30 years?
Right. Wonderful question. I just love this line of questioning. They're not deep stories, they're deep questions. And I have two things come to mind about to answer how it could have gone differently. One is a kind of critique, and here I would go back to the idea that the left itself has become a little detached from the blue collar class, that is the Democratic Party. And here we see with Thomas Frank, for example, listen, liberal, who's kind of a screed and kind of angry. Look, you guys have been conservative. Clinton's a Democrat, but he opened the doors to climate change. He locked down the Black working class male. He was conservative. So in a way, the party itself became Brahmin, and the left was a little bit hung out to dry as a movement. So that in a way, the Democratic Party sold the blue collar class out. It failed. It really failed. It became, there were Democratic lobbyists who rolled from their job as representatives into lucrative industry jobs. And where were their interests? Were they representing the people? No, in fact.
Arlie, can I just jump in with a footnote there? I really apologize for interrupting your flow, but just the footnote would be that you can see exactly the same process with Tony Blair and the Labor government, exactly analogous to Clinton. And that parallel seems important in terms of thinking about the evidence, because those are two pretty different socioeconomic climates, but the pattern of a theoretically left party that actually veered towards the center and arguably governed right repeats itself in both of these big economies. So that's
to make that point even more forcefully, it's kind of, at least in Piketty's view, the story of the entire advanced capitalist world. It's the story of what happened to social democracy, social democratic parties in Europe as well, right? Which to me is only more depressing. I was hoping the second point you were going to make, Arlie, was going to give us. So it's partly what the Democrats did, you were saying, but then is there a source also for maybe more optimism or more hope here?
Well, sure. I see some possibility for substituting for unions. In other words, I see two other possibilities. One is getting a political movement up, and of people who are in alliance with locally based blue collar workers.
Do you see hope elsewhere in the world for that kind of strategy that you're describing that could potentially work in America as well? Yeah.
Well, I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah.
I've been pretty limited on this thing, but it's a great question to ask. Let's keep it there. But going back to the U.S., an interesting thing happened to me. The telephone rang, and at the other end was a Democratic congressman named Ro Khanna, California. He represents Silicon Valley. And he says, look, half my constituencies are immigrants from other countries. I represent Facebook and Microsoft, a lot of Silicon Valley. And he said, but I made an alliance with Hal Rogers of Paintville, Kentucky. They've got all these unemployed coal miners, and they don't have another job. They're all voting Republican. And me, I'm Democrat over here. We've got jobs, but we outsource them to Bangalore. Why don't we outsource them to Paintsville? And Hal Rogers said, yeah, Silicon Holler. I actually wrote an op-ed for the Times on this experiment and went to look at the coding training program, which is in Louisville, and interviewed some of the transformed lives of blue collar, desperate lives of people whose lives have been completely transformed by this internal outsourcing. So that is something that could be built up, that could be a part of a strategy of a redirection of this whole thing of investing and divesting, invest more.
Well, I was thinking about, as you were describing the government and the unions as the two sectors that have suffered the most, I was wondering about this new push towards a global minimum tax as potentially being something that can boost both of those sectors, since unions need people to be doing jobs domestically in order to have a base to.
Well, but I think, I mean, not to sound a dour note, I think here, though, we run into the problem that I think Piketty runs into as well, because Piketty's book is also full of these ambitious social democratic global proposals. The trouble is, I think, if, Arlie, we take your narrative to be correct, which I think I was very compelled by about the structural transformations of American capitalism, there's a problem of power, I think, lurking in the background, which is how do you force companies which are so powerful, as your book demonstrates, as you were saying, how do you force companies without any kind of social force like unions or something like this? How do you force them to bend to the vision of a social democratic utopia, one in which they'd be paying higher taxes and redistributing? I just think you can't, so many of these proposals, I worry, try to do an end run around the big problem of power, which makes me a little, not pessimistic, but just a little, thinking that maybe we need to maybe there's a step that we're missing, which is first we have to think about, before we think about proposals, I think we also need to think about how are we going to build up the kind of social force, the kind of counter power that can allow us to push these sorts of policies.
Chicken, meat, egg.
Chicken, meat, egg.
Yeah. Excellent point, excellent stone in the road. We need to focus on, but power also goes with a search for legitimacy. And I think you can erode power by eroding the legitimacy of it.
can I just say, I really appreciate you using the word legitimacy in that context. I think that's a word that Adana and I haven't used, and we need to think it through more, because it's both speaks to the kind of empathetic and emotional orientation that is people have to feel buy-in, but it has a kind of structural meaning too. Like you have legitimacy as a party when you speak to or for your constituents, but you also have to have like you also have to connect to them as well. And I think legitimacy speaks to that way, that you're both solving structural and material questions, and you're also figuring out what is the common language we have. So
the power of Donald Trump is centrally the stealing of legitimacy. I mean, legitimacy isn't a minor afterthought here.
Yeah.
That is his power. That is he's taken it to the grassroots. You've lost, you guys. Hillary is just talking about, oh, the American dream. You can get there, just work hard. No, she's wrong. You've lost something. Something's been stolen. That's the paramount. And the different narratives based on lost and stealing. He has won legitimacy. No, he doesn't have power, but he does have legitimacy, and that is lightning in a jar. So we're wrong to think, oh, that's the same thing. Oh, that's soft cultural stuff. Well, no, that's not true at all. Well, hugely powerful in just this way.
I really hear that. But then the question might become, can you make the claim of illegitimacy, which is fundamentally what he founds his power on, the basis of your legitimacy? Like, in other words, is that a sustainable kind of legitimacy?
I worry, honestly. I think we're in a fight, really. It's very, I don't think he's going to fade. I don't think he's going to fade. He's a charismatic leader. If we read Max Weber, the characteristics of charismatic, you are the source of all knowledge yourself. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, all the characteristics we see in Trump. And if it weren't him, we now know the lightning
playbook.
That lightning has to do with emotional. Here's where the sociology of emotions comes in, and it's fundamental to the building or dismantling of legitimacy, which is not incidental to power. So if we think of power as in some denuded way, we're barking up the wrong tree. This is, I think, what we have to understand, theorize, focus on, get, is how you get somebody's emotions. That's why I was, and am still now, we're kind of trying to look at that lightning in the jar, because he holds the Republican vote. That's power, right? So legitimacy and power are not separable. And that's what's holding all these Republicans to the votes they are taking.
I just wanted to ask you what you thought about the possibility that when you say that we're in a fight and we need, in some ways, I think, to go back to the terms of your argument, what you're saying we need is a alternative, compelling, deep story to tell that speaks to people's emotions. But I wonder whether, so to take it to the efforts that you were describing to link high schoolers from different areas and to really break down the empathy wall in the terms of your argument, I wonder whether what is maybe missing but could easily be added is deep story, and maybe this is the version of the liberal deep story that you were saying that we work with, but I wonder whether, if we just think of if we think of the characters of the deep story that the right tells, which is the people who've been waiting in line, the line cutters, the federal government, what it seems to me is easy to add to that deep story and maybe render in kind of a left way is to say, yes, you have been waiting in line for a long time. And yes, you are competing with certain people who are also working class, not doing very well themselves for the crumbs of the American dream. But there is this fraction of elites who are making off incredibly well, as you were saying yourself, over the last 30, 40 years. And so maybe maybe it's a case of trying to unite those two characters against someone else. Maybe that's where the emotion and the anger can come from. Because I just worry you can't have a deep story without a certain enemy or a certain kind of anger or something.
A focus
of your, I mean, and I was wondering whether you've tried that kind of deep story with your interlocutors, with the people that you interviewed, and whether with any success.
I haven't, no. But I tell you what, there are many clues that you're really right. And one in this, I'm going to have to get off too. But one is that I often heard about Bernie Sanders. Oh, Bernie Sanders, he's a socialist, and we're not socialist. And but Uncle Bernie. Uncle Bernie, and they love him.
Yeah.
So why do they love him? There is a legitimacy to him. There is an honor to him. He's not speaking. He doesn't have all the tunes on the piano of this ideological piano that can be heard by him, but he has major chords. Major chords, they're already there, but they're untapped by the Brahmins, but there by Bernie Sanders himself. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah. Well, I like that answer. Yeah. I love that metaphor of the piano. Wow.
Yeah. Well, so on that musical metaphor, we'll just say that thank you so much, Arlie. This is great.
Yeah, what a pleasure.
It's really fun. They're great questions. I love the project.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm just going to say real quick that Recall This Book is sponsored by Brandeis and the Mandel Humanities Center. Sound editing by Naomi Cohen. Website design and social media by Miranda Puri of the English department. Adana and I are really eager to hear your comments, criticisms, and thoughts on today's discussion and on the notion of the Brahmin left generally. And we will be back in a couple of weeks with a wrap-up episode where we discuss all three of our conversations. So please write a review or rate us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcast. And if you enjoyed today's show, please check out our earlier Brahmin left conversations with Matt Karp and Jan Werner Muller. You might also check out our conversation with David Cunningham on white supremacism and the FBI, and our conversation with Piketty himself on proprietarian ideologies. So from all of us here at Recall This Book, thank you so much, Arlie, and thank you all for listening.